Hello and welcome back. And does that look familiar to you? Does that look like a Terramaster NAS? Well, you're wrong. This is the Terramaster D4 SSD, a 4 x M.2 NVMe DAS system with USB4 40 gig connectivity there. That is right. For those aren't aware, Terramaster, although they've got a bunch of different NAS systems out there in the field, they've actually got a lot of DAS solutions as well. I've talked about this in other videos, but I think we should really take a moment to look at this brand's extensive collection of not only USB connected and Thunderbolt connected devices, but now a growing USB 4 selection of external storage devices, either to expand your NAS system or to use it as a traditional standalone NAS. Now, we talked about this one last year. This is the hybrid. This is the hybrid D8, by the way. It has got 4 SATA hard drive bays and 4 M.2 NVMe bays there, connected with 10 gig USB. On top of that, we've got things like this. This is a 1U 4-bay, incredibly short depth USB 10 gig DAS box here that you can use to expand your NAS system there. This knocks around, by the way, for about $299 to $399. Again, a lovely bit of kit. It doesn't even stop there. We recently talked about this sod. This is the D1, a USB 4 sustained performance M.2 NVMe storage device there. They have got form, is what I'm saying. But this is the one that I've wanted to know about for a while, because M.2 NVMe and USB 4 is something of a tricky subject that generally is getting very, very difficult to explain without talking about certain caveats, something we'll touch on later on. But there are actually quite a lot of USB 4 M.2 NVMe boxes in the market, from brand names that you've heard of, right the way down to third-party Eastern brands that you've never heard of at all. And this knocking around at $299 is probably one of the best that I've seen in terms of its construction. It's not perfect, it certainly isn't. There's a couple of little limitations I want to talk about, but this tackles two of the biggest issues of DAS boxes that support USB 4 and M.2 NVMe. Number one is cooling and temperature, with an insane amount of active cooling, ventilation, right the way funneled in, by the way, into the board itself. The PCB is riddled in ventilation all the way along. This thing runs cool. I will say the brand doesn't include any heat sinks, which for good and for bad we'll talk about later on. But in terms of performance under, sustained load and where that impacts temperatures, I will say this thing stands up. But the other area in which this thing stands apart from a lot of the options in the market is simply the distribution of lanes and performance internally. Now, a lot of the cheaper boxes, and one we are going to be talking about later in the month here on the channel, a lot of the cheaper boxes, they are effectively low-rent, SATA-based DAS boxes that have been lightly souped up with a USB connection and M.2s, but the controllers, the ICs inside, are still SATA-based. One of the biggest problems facing USB connected DAS boxes that use Gen 4 SSD is they're getting funneled into terrible controllers in the middle, which ultimately harm the performance. And it means you can end up with a DAS box like this that completely gutter balls on the external performance in the long term. You have brands shouting loud about USB 4 connectivity and 40 gigabits per second, 4,000 megs per second, or 4 gigabytes per second, but still nonetheless are never ever going to achieve even close to that due to those internal components. What makes this stand out is not only does the brand name the exact lane allocation for each of those M.2s right on the official page as well, with each of the M.2s labelled on the board and on the official pages at Gen 4 × 1 speed, but the controller inside the ASM2464 PDX, I'm catchy and available at parties, is more than enough to make sure that handling those individual individual lane allocations into this and funneling them out of the USB 4 means that this can achieve those speeds of over 3,000 megabytes per second. However, we've got to address the elephant in the room. This thing doesn't have RAID. It's a JBOD, just a bunch of drives, and you are going to be relying on your host system, be it a NAS for expandability, or if you're going to be utilizing a PC or Mac system, you can't just add RAID in this box. It has to be managed by the host system, which not everyone's in love with. It does reduce a lot of the load, and we will talk about power consumption later on, but still nonetheless, that is going to be a bit bothersome for some. But that ultimately means the performance numbers are sort of going to be dependent on your client system as well. So in terms of my performance, I went ahead and connected this to a PC system. Now on that PC system, I ran 3 different tests across 2 different configurations. Now with only one SSD inside the system, because I wanted to see what the benefits of utilizing RAID versus not RAID would be, we can see that in AJA, with a single drive inside the system mounted with a repeated 1GB test, we saw performance numbers of around 1400 megabytes per second over 1300 megabytes per second, read and write respectively. Again, remember, that is one SSD. Now in terms of Crystal Disk, we saw read performance of 1480, write performance of 1140, and mixed 70-30 read-write ratio of 1286 megabytes per second with a repeated 1 gig test. Finally, in Atto, we saw read performance there at 1.57 gigabytes and write performance at 1.4 to 1.5 gigabytes per second there. Now keep in mind, each one of those M.2 lanes are at Gen 4 times 1 speed. That allows for up to 2000 megabytes per second. So we saw, 3/4 saturation there with that one SSD. But how did that translate over to RAID performance? I went ahead and had 4 drives inside and using just standard Windows Disk Manager, which by the way is by no means a heavy set RAID controller. So again, expect the performance to be likewise. When I had the 4 drives in a RAID 0 environment, the performance was as follows. AJA, again, repeated 1 gig test. I achieved performance of 2500 megabytes per second read and around 2300 megabytes per second write in AJA. In Crystal Disk, I saw read performance of around 2047 megabytes per second, write performance of 1927, and that mixed 70-30, 1799 megabytes per second. And Atto finally there, peak 2.93 or so gigabytes per second and write at 2.65 gigabytes per second there. So yeah, we didn't achieve big excess 3 gigabytes per second performance numbers there. Had I used a high performance RAID controller and connected it to this device, which again at this cost level, I'm not quite sure who's going to buy a cheap USB DAS box with a high-end RAID controller. I'm confident from what I could see there that I would have seen sustained performance in excess of 3 gigabytes per second there, which again, when you factor in the USB4 port there, achieving a maximum 4 at total bandwidth, realistically not going to happen. I was pleased with those numbers. Next up, noise levels, because you're probably going to be in relative close proximity to this, and I'm pleased to say that when I had all 4 SSDs being accessed at exactly the same time, and the fans ramping up to their maximum temperature level, the noise was still pretty darn quiet. Next up, power consumption. This device here needs mains power. One of the things that really bums me out about it, and I get when it comes to M.2 NVMe's, you can get to maybe as high as 2 M.2s in a low profile, high power delivery environment to run it off USB bus, but 4 M.2s were never going to run off USB bus power alone, even though the system arrives with frankly an insanely OP power cable, USB cable here. When I talked earlier on about the little 1-bay, this 1-bay, I'm not sure if that video is live yet, one of my criticisms is it arrives with a terrible short cable. Actually, I've rephrased that. It's a good cable, USB4 40 gig rated 240 watt, but it's really short. This, on the other hand, came with a much better cable. And by better, I don't just mean a good length cable, I mean this cable is rated at 80 gigabits per second and it's a 240 watt delivery there. That is a cable that is way OP for this box on a single USB 4 connection. But in terms of power delivery, I ran 3 different scenarios. I ran the system with all the drives in pure hibernation, 1 with all the drives in standby, and 1 with all the drives being accessed simultaneously there. It went as low as almost to just a watt when it was all of the disks just in standby off the PSU. Lovely stuff. And that was with the USB 4 cable connected. It went up to around 3 to 4 watts when I had all of the drives sitting there in standby rather than hibernation. And finally, at peak access, it only went between 5 to 6 watts power utilization. It is a DAS, that's not a huge surprise, but still low power consumption for a high performance storage device there. It's a shame about the lack of RAID though. Alongside that, there is software available from Terramaster for backing up your client system, be it on a file folder level or whole system level. onto this device when needed. And there's also versioning there as well with backupper, but there's also a mobile application that genuinely allows you to just directly connect this device, or indeed that little one bay, directly to your Android device. I think there is an iOS app as well, and directly back up multiple images, whether it is just photos or just a whole system image, repeatedly with different versions if you need to. I know not everyone's going to be in love with using a Chinese application and connect it to their phone or client device, so it is completely optional, but I just wanted to touch on the fact that they do include it, and fair play to them. You can use this on a Thunderbolt 3 connected device. They had to be strict 3x4 speed allocation, whereas USB4 and Thunderbolt 4 can be a lot more flexible with 4x1, 4x2, multiple 4x1, the 4x2 and the 4x1 and the 4x2. They can do that. It can be a lot more flexible with lane allocation and therefore allow for better separation across drive bays in DAS boxes like this. I know it's deep and technical, but the point I'm making is this is a DAS 4-bay USB4 box entering a very saturated marketplace, but it does so with very distinct advantages if you just spend an extra 10 or 15 seconds looking at it, which unfortunately I think the brand aren't doing a fantastic job of making clear to end users. Bottom line, can I recommend this? Sure as hell can. As a 4-bay USB4 DAS box, it's got that sweet spot between price, capability, and architecture internally. Again, the brand could stand to be louder. As an expansion device, for those of you perhaps that bought the F8 SSD, this is going to allow you to add a significantly big storage increase in terms of M.2 NVMe without having to leverage towards hard drives if you need to. Just keep in mind that very few, I believe perhaps even no, Terramaster NASs have USB4 connections at this time. They all use 10 gig USB, and the result is this will be capped to 1 gigabyte per second. Another thing I will say about this device for all of my recommendations, number one, the fact it lacks RAID will be a deal breaker for some, and you've got to bear that in mind, that is going to be both the responsibility and the overhead of your client system. Also, for all of the nice things I said about cooling, in terms of the ventilation, in terms of the perforation of the PCBs there, and just general system operation and power consumption, doesn't arrive with heat sinks. Now, the heat sinks cost nothing. And when you look at the F8 and the F4 and other Terramaster NASs that are M.2 NVMe based, and they are at Gen 3x1 and Gen 3x2 speed, by the way, having a device running at Gen 4x1 speed, although heatsinks aren't strictly as necessary as traditional 4x4, I do think the brand could have stood to include 4 heatsinks for your M.2s inside. There is buckets of room. They definitely could have put them in there. But these criticisms aside, it's still a fantastically well put together package in terms of value and what you are getting for your money. And in terms of the accessories it arrives with, the software options if you need them, and whether you're going to use it as a NAS expansion or just a standalone DAS for your client machine, I really like this. And as I've said before, I've always been quite an interested fan in Terramaster and their DAS expansions, because when brands like Drobo fell off the grid and options for Thunderbolt and USB4 connected DAS boxes have become very murky in the retail market, these solutions work, and I do recommend them. Thank you so much for watching. There should be a written review link below coming very, very soon, and if it is live, it's there. If you found the video helpful, and if you're going to go to the shops that I've listed below to get hold of one of these, please use the links below to do so. Doing that results in a small commission coming here to NASCompares. It's just me and Eddie doing this, and it allows us to keep doing what we do. Anything you buy via those will result in a commission, so go hog wild. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.